Innovations in musical practice following the advent of electronic sound recording technologies in the 1940s have expanded the range of possible materials from which music is comprised. These innovations took the form of work with environmental and recorded sound often associated with the GRM in Paris, and work with artificial sound sources typically linked to the Cologne studios of the WDR. These developments extended existing performance practice including electronic instruments such as the theremin and troptonium and developments in sound amplification. The divisions between these approaches are often overplayed in the literature as the historical record shows that many of the individual composers both in Europe and in other parts of the world were engaged in using a variety of materials and technologies in their practice. Much of the debate arises from a set of polemical positions taken up regarding the need for sound materials sufficiently abstract for the purposes of musical composition. Uncertainty regarding not only these materials and their relations within music, but also the domain boundaries of musical practice demands a reappraisal of the basic identity of sound itself. In the analytical tradition of musical aesthetics, the ontology of the musical work has been the subject of considerable discussion. British philosopher Roger Scruton embraces the ontological ambiguity inherent in the description of sound as events and processes whose temporal extents cannot be tied down and furthermore as intentional objects that leave no trace in terms of material objects that have undergone transformation. These considerations are also supported from a phenomenological perspective in the horizon properties of sounds as described by Ide. But Scruton goes further, theorizing a sound world separate from the physical world inhabited by, for example, visual stimuli. Here Scruton adopts Schaeffer's concept of the acousmatic, sounds heard independently of their sources. Scruton's project is, however, different from Schaeffer's, in that he is concerned to introduce the concept of the tone from which he can establish the basis for the definition and analysis of musical sound. Scruton's tone is an acousmatic event, which is heard apart from the everyday physical world, which leads to a particular type of musical experience determined by the properties and relations of musical tones. Scruton's musical world, like that of Boulez, does not admit the broad scope of sound materials imagined by Schaeffer, John Cage and others. For Scruton, music is not just any art of sound such as the design of fountains or poetry, both of which involve the careful organization of sound. Music for Scruton is the organization of musical tones. While, for Scruton, this approach leads to a rather conservative musical outlook, it does furnish us with a useful perspective for the ontological analysis of sound materials. Scruton compares the transformation of sound into tone with the transformation of sound into a word. Hearing spoken utterance is not so much hearing the sound of a voice as it is hearing a set of meanings. This observation is echoed in the Schaeffer's analysis of listening and also in Deleuze's account of incorporeal or surface effects of which language is one. This opening up of the functional or ontological status of sound moves from the particular cases of words and tones into the broader semiology of the soundscape in Jacques's 2005 work on communication acoustics and sound design. The arguments to expand Scruton's ontology of sound come from various quarters, not the least from Schaeffer's phenomenologically informed analysis of musical objects. Schaeffer's models of both sound objects and listening modes as intentional correlatives prefigures the dynamic or multi-stable ontology found in Ide's post-phenomenology. An interest in ontological distinctions is not a merely arid intellectual exercise, but potentially holds the key to understanding much of the aesthetic impact of sound material in artistic, environmental and design contexts. This project is taken up in the ethnography of Jean-François Aguillard. Aguillard provides a systematic analysis of the phenomenal properties of the sound effects latent in environmental sound. This idea of sound effects may be compared to the Deleuzean notion of surface effects or pure events, in which we gain another perspective on the ontological status of sound, echoing Scruton, as fields of force. For Deleuze, surface effects have the paradoxical nature of being incorporeal or non-existent entities. As sound or sounds already have the property of not being entirely constituted in the present, we can readily see their relation to other surface effects such as language. It is this multi-stable ontology of not only verbal utterance, but all sound, that furnishes us with much of its aesthetic appeal. Sound effects are continually in a state of becoming or passing away. Sound is always in some aspect both pre-existing and culturally determined, and a unique temporally evolving event, both creating the listener and defined by them. As Schiefer points out, the scientific prejudice in our relations with the world make us inclined to treat these effects as ambiguity or confusion over the material identity of the sound or its cause. However, the true nature of sound may be such that underlying these moments of uncertainty is an uncertainty about its mode of existence and by implication, our relation to the world itself. This ontology/identity paradox may hold the key to aspects of our aesthetic engagement with sound. The humanities-based field of sound studies has little trouble in dealing with the broadest range of conceptions for the word sound. For example, in his excellent and penetrating study of sound in Shakespeare, Wes Fogarth easily moves between the various noun and verb forms, finding in them some essentially common aspects of human experience as imagined by the playwright. The Oxford English Dictionary provides 6 noun forms, 1 adjective, 4 verbs, and 1 adverb. Of the nouns, which might reasonably be considered the subject of ontology, the one that is the central focus of this essay, has 8 distinct groupings in recorded English usage. These 8 yield 30 distinct uses or senses. While the 30 are not necessarily ontologically differentiated, this statistic gives more evidence of the complexity of the subject matter at hand. To quote Gerald Brunzexus defines the ontology of sound, which is perhaps why poetry exploits it. Evidence of the importance of these paradoxical or ambiguous features of sound can be found in the use of sound references or images as a device in poetry. As an example, I offer the following analysis of William Wordsworth's The Solitary Reaper, 1807. In this poem, Wordsworth describes the experience of hearing a "solitary highland lass singing" while working in a nearby field. Perhaps due to the song being sung in dialect, or due to the listener's proximity, he is unable to clearly perceive the words being sung or their meaning. I detect, in 12 separate sound references, 9 distinct types or classes of sound. For further information on these ideas, I recommend you talk to Ian Stevenson at the University of Western Sydney.